coming out this afternoon to attend the ERC Seminar Series. We're delighted to have Dr. Luis Ponjuan presenting today. He's an associate professor in higher ed administration in the Department of Educational Administration and Human Resource Development at Texas A&M. His research focuses on Latino males' educational achievement, first-generation students' access into higher education and degree attainment, and the recruitment and retention of faculty members of color. He has received numerous grants and has received numerous awards as well. And we're delighted that you've come here to present today. Thank
you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to be here this morning or this afternoon, and I am excited to share some of the work that I'm doing. I'm trying to make sure I keep my timer on so I don't go over my time. So I'll keep myself honest here with my timer. My name is Dr. Luis Ponjuan. I'm a faculty member here, and this is my beginning of my second year. So I am told that I have to use proper protocol, so I'm going to have to say howdy.
Howdy.
See, I'm learning. I'm learning all the proper protocol, so I'm glad that you indulged me a little bit because obviously I'm still trying to determine what does it mean to be a Texan. And someone told me I have to have three things. I have to have a cowboy hat, I need to have cowboy boots, and I need to have a truck. I don't have any of those, so I'm not an official Texan yet. I'm working on the boots though. I was told that I need to get some boots this on this upcoming holiday season. But nonetheless, I'm here, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that I've done. And I want to share with you more specifically why I'm doing this work. And one of the biggest challenges that I have found in the work that I've done is that there are a multitude of issues surrounding this notion of access to higher education. And when you take a closer look at the scenario and you take a closer look at the demographics of our communities that we serve, we start to see some trends. And so my hope today is that I engage with you into what I consider an academic talk. I've talked earlier to Dr. Waxman that a lot of the times I give a lot of talks across the country and I try to keep it very consumer friendly. But today I'm going to use a little bit more of the research behind some of the things that I talk about to larger communities or what I consider end users who are practitioners. So my hope is that I engage with you to have a conversation about the things that I've looked at. So today's talk really focuses on a balancing act. Latino first-generation students' college campus engagement intentions and employment obligations. When you start thinking about what that really means, you start recognizing, I was going to say initially with the title, an inherent tension. Because sometimes it is a tension trying to balance becoming involved on campus and being engaged on campus, whether it's academic or socially, and actually having to work, which is a very real scenario for a lot of first-generation students, even more so for Latino students. So when we start thinking about a balancing act, we start to recognize a couple of things. First, we want to take a look at Latinos in education. What is the status? Well, interestingly enough, if you take a closer look at what's happening to the Latino population in the country, Texas and California represent almost half of the Latino population in the United States. Half. That is an impressive number. We're talking over almost 16 million Latinos in the state of Texas. And so when we start thinking about why should we be invested in this topic and why should we care, this is a big issue. It's a big issue because when I talk about this in different communities, I talk about the economic engine of Texas is going to be the Latino population. And so we need to think about ways, how do we increase access to what I consider the most at-risk students in our communities. And when you take a look at what the resource or the talent pool that we're dealing with, we're talking about Latino students in Texas education. Interestingly enough, when we take a closer look at the enrollment by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, we are at 82% capacity, meaning that we are still about 18% off of the target of students that should be enrolled in higher education. When we start thinking about 18%, almost 1 in 5 students are not going to college, and the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board is saying that we need them to go to college. They say that because they recognize the connection between college-educated workforce and the Latino population. So as it goes now, we are not meeting the mark in terms of having Latinos go to college. Not at all. In fact, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board is saying that we need to do even more efforts to increase access to higher education. But when you take a look at the national enrollment, it's no surprise. Currently, the national enrollment for Latino students is 60%. That's a pretty good number, but compared to white students, it's 82%. We're still not on par with the other groups. So we have a challenge in front of us. We have a real issue of students not going to college. More importantly, what happens if they do go to college in terms of their opportunity to actually complete. So we really wanted to take a closer look at what's happening to the students in pre-college as well as in beginning college in terms of their intent to get involved. Well, we wanted to take a closer look to understand the relationship between particularly first-generation incoming students and their pre-college characteristics and their intention to become engaged in their institution. Now, we all know the literature says a great deal about this P16 transition. This idea that how do we get students who are in high school to go to college, and how do we ensure that when they're in high school that they're adequately prepared to go to college and have the necessary skill sets to be successful in college. And so we take a closer look at this, and we try to ask the question, what pre-college involvement behaviors and individual demographic characteristics influence first-generation college students' intention for college engagement? The research is really clear. When we take a look at the literature, researchers have explored how certain student characteristics affect transitions to college and college outcomes. The fact of the matter is, when students come to college, they're not starting at the same starting line. The fact is, a lot of these students, particularly first-generation students, are about 10 or 15 yards away from the start line. And those 10 or 15 yards are described as not having the AP curriculum at their high school, not having the social capital of family and friends who have gone to college for who have gone to college before them, not having the cultural capital associated with a legacy of students who before them and families before them have gone to college. So the fact of the matter is, a lot of these students are dealing with an uphill battle, and at the end, what happens is a lot of these students are less likely to matriculate and eventually graduate. We believe that high school experiences play a particular role that can influence students' college engagement intentions. The fact of the matter is, what's happening in high schools play a critical role in how we educate and prepare students to be successful in college. When we start thinking about the literature that's out there, we're going to start talking a little bit about what that means and what that looks like. And that also tags along with what the Education Resource Center is doing here. This idea of what is happening in today's schools and how do we connect that to higher education. I get a lot of feedback from a lot of folks that talk about the challenges between the chasm between K-12 and higher education. That they're two different worlds. It's interesting that we have those conversations when a lot of the students who are in education see it as a seamless process. They graduate from high school and they go to college. When in fact, very often, unfortunately, a lot of scholars in the K-12 world don't interact or engage in research activities with the higher education folks. So my hope or my intent in this conversation today is to show you how some of the work that I'm doing focuses on the K-12 world and how that relates to higher education. I'm trying to span that chasm to really connect the dots there. So it's our responsibility to think differently about these issues, but more importantly, how do we partner together in addressing some of these issues? And so we take a closer look. We recognize that college engagement is essential to college retention and academic success. The fact is, the more you invest, the more you're involved, the more you're engaged on campus, the greater your outcomes will be. You're likely to stay, you're likely to get better grades, you're likely to interact with faculty, all of the things that we believe are essential elements to college success. But unfortunately, there's an inherent tension. Earlier I talked about a balancing act, but here I'm just kind of telling you like it is. There's an inherent tension between becoming engaged and work obligations, especially for Latino first-generation students. And you may wonder, why am I even looking at Latino first-generation students? The fact of the matter is, that was me. That was me well, not just a few years ago, but many years ago. That was me. When I take a look at the factors that influence my decisions to go to college and the factors that influence my ability to finish college, I recognize that I'm a walking miracle. The fact of the matter is, the college that I went to, if you go take a look at there's several websites that take a look at the college that you go to has graduation rates, right? Every college has a graduation rate. After 6 years, how many students who started 6 years ago actually finished? The university that I went to had a graduation rate of 20%. To this day, I am a walking miracle, because while I had an institution that only had a 20% graduation rate, I was also working, and I'm not ashamed to say it, I worked at McDonald's all during my undergraduate career. I lived at home. I worked as a work-study student, and I also worked in an emergency room. Back then they had x-rays, and I would deliver x-rays back and forth from the emergency room to the x-ray room, and I worked the night shift overnight. That was my reality. That's what I dealt with. So when I do the work that I do, I really talk about this work that I do as not being research, but it's a lot like me-search. Understanding what it means to be a first-generation Latino student in today's higher education system. And more critically, because of the platform that I have an obligation to raise awareness about this issue, particularly in the state of Texas, because the tension is real and the stakes are high. So, unfortunately, there's limited empirical research on first-generation students' college engagement intentions. So we need to take a closer look at what's happening in this area. So like I said, I'm going to go a little bit nerdy on you, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the theoretical framework that guides this study. Isaac Agjen is a psychologist that really believed that we don't just do things spur of the moment. The fact of the matter is, we have intentions, and those intentions manifest themselves into behaviors. And so understanding how individual psychology influences decisions of where you go to school, what do you plan to do, and what do you plan to wear to go to class today, are all behaviors that are predestined through the intentions that we experience. The theory of planned behavior suggests that individual behavior is a precursor to an individual's intention for future behavior. So the precursor is this intent. And so he argued and suggested that there were three elements that make up why we have particular behaviors, why we do particular behaviors. The first one is individuality towards behavior. That is, if you have a positive attitude, or have a positive experience with something, then you're more likely to do that behavior. In other words, if you had a good experience in high school, you might want to go to college. Or if you had a bad experience in high school, your attitude might be a little bit poor and say, college is not for me. So there's a big element that talks about what were your prior experiences and how did that dictate your future behavior. The individual perceived social pressure or expectations, the subjective norm. The fact is, our behavior is a function of the interactions we have with others who we consider important others. Interestingly enough, when we start thinking about students who are in high school, who is the most influential group to those students? Their peers. So when we start talking about subjective norm, you start to realize some of the social pressures dictating behavior. And if you have a high school that has a lot of students not going to college, they're already predestined to think differently about going to college to begin with, let alone to be involved. And then finally, individual perceived sense of behavior control. How do students believe that they have an opportunity to actually do what they want to do and feel like they have control of doing that? Often, a lot of students have, we call a lack of self-agency. This idea that they aren't in control of their own destiny. And they don't believe they can have an option to do anything. And a lot of that is always premeditated because of the lack of financial opportunity. I can't do this because I don't see how I can do this without having to work. That controls my behavior, knowing that it's going to be an uphill battle to pay for college. And so having those forces, previous experience, peer groups, and this notion that I have no control over my destiny really plays a critical role in how students move forward with their decisions to get involved on campus. So taking a big picture look, we have first generation students, we have pre-college engagement, what are they doing in high school, and their experiences leading up to high school, and how do they determine these engagement intentions. That's kind of like the big picture from the literature. We use AGDEN to kind of set the tone in terms of what we want to talk about. So the data source that we use for this study, we use data from the University, UCLA in Los Angeles does a study that captures information from all incoming students every year. It's called the CERP. And this cooperative interinstitutional research program, policy, or whatever, basically collects data from hundreds and hundreds of colleges across the campus. Across the nation, I'm sorry. And what we did is that we wanted to identify first-generation students. As you can imagine, first-generation students are a growing number, but back when we did this study, we had to collapse 3 years to capture a robust number. So we ended up having 15,000 students across 3 years, and 12% of those were first-generation students. And we looked only at first-generation students because we want to understand first-generation students' experiences. We had two dependent variables, which really kind of play off of each other. The first one is intention for institutional engagement. What are your intentions? Are you more likely or less likely to do some of the things that we believe are important in college engagement? And a binary outcome, are you going to have to work? And we wanted to see if there was a tension between your desire to want to get involved and the reality that you have to work, that behavioral control piece. We looked at several independent variable blocked groups. We looked at student demographics, pre-college characteristics, and college characteristics. And we conducted two analytic methods or models that we explored. We did a multivariate ordinary least squares regression analysis for the institutional engagement model, and we did a multivariate ordinary logistic regression analysis for the intention for employment model. And so when you take a look at the dependent variable, this is the dependent variable that we used, the factor scale. We had an alpha about 0.64, not the best, but strong enough. Whether likely they're going to participate in student clubs, participate in volunteer service work, participate in student government, participate in study abroad programs, what we believe are critical engagement opportunities for students. And we just wanted to see not whether it's an academic, but really a co-curricular component. Because we also believe a lot of the things that they did in high school are similar to what they would do in college. The fact is, a lot of the students in their professional resumes say, I was involved in volunteer work. So we kind of felt that if you did that in high school, what's the likelihood that you'd want to do that in college? And here's the results, and this is kind of the most complicated slide that we have here in terms of who was more likely to get involved in engagement in the work intentions model. And so when we take a look at some of the results, I'll just highlight a couple of things. First, females, now remember this is just first generation students only. Female first generation students compared to male first generation students are going to be more likely to become engaged. Right off the bat, what does that tell you about male first generation students on this college campus? Are they in danger? What does the study clearly indicate? That these young men are checking out and are saying from the very beginning, I'm not going to get engaged on your campus already. When you take a look at what's happening between males and the different ethnic groups, African American males were more likely to get involved than white, Latino, than white, and then there was no difference there. And then you take a look at some of the characteristics. If you had low high school engagement, you were less likely to be involved. If you had moderate engagement, you were less likely to get involved. If you were a less than stellar student, you were less likely to get involved. And then when you take a look at living arrangements or college characteristics, if you lived off campus, you were less likely to be involved. And more critically, if you had concerns about paying for college versus no concern, you were less likely to get involved. And so you're starting to see a picture of what's happening to the students who are coming to our campus as it relates to their desire to get involved. We are made it very clear that if you don't get involved, they have dire consequences. When you take a closer look at the work model, you'll see, which is really interesting, less likely, all of the different ethnic groups were less likely to work than the white reference group, which we talked a little bit about there. And then here, first generation students were more likely to have to work. Taking a look at that. Well, I take that back, we did use the non-first gen students in this data set. But what I wanted to show you is, what does this mean? What does this look like? When we take a look at first generation student demographics, two things came up very clearly. There are gender differences when we deal with engagement. And those gender differences have really long-term consequences. There were some ethnic group differences as well that were a little bit challenging to try to wrap your head around. And we kind of addressed that in the paper. But nonetheless, highlight this idea that some of these students are going to have to work and have to try to navigate their experiences. Prior high school engagement, that was probably the most powerful outcome that we found. Students who are not involved in high school and go to college are at the greatest risk of not becoming engaged on campus. So when we think about how do we reformulate what high schools do with our students and get them engaged, according to Ashton's theory, we have to do a better job of creating positive experiences in high school so that they can equate that to creating positive experiences of engagement in college. The fact is, these students are checking out before they even check in. And when we take a closer look at college-related factors, not living on campus is a huge issue. The fact is, when we start thinking about what happens to students who live off campus, they are, in essence, disconnected from the community, disengaged from the community. In fact, some of the research in some of the universities across the nation are making it mandatory for first-year students to go and live on campus. But even more critical, we'll talk about it in a minute, it's even more critical to have first-generation students have first priority, given their dire circumstances. And then finally, the financial demands in campus engagement. This is just a sad reality that we're dealing with. The fact is, a lot of these students are concerned about how they're going to go to college and balance being involved. And we have to think differently about what that looks like, because as the results show, the demands in campus engagement are at odds with one another. And we have to think about how to address that in proactive and constructive ways, as administrators, and more importantly, as faculty. And so what are the implications for policy and practice? For Latino students, first-generation Latino students, identify those students who are at greatest risk for not becoming engaged. We already highlighted some of the gender differences, but when we start thinking about in the Texas demographics, Latino first-generation students are the folks that we should be really most concerned with. But more critically, what role does ERC play in informing, or what I would consider, creating the narrative in the high schools about these students? And how do we prepare them? There's a lot of work out there that talks about socialization. And some of the work that I've used and some other work that relies on some organizational site talks about anticipatory socialization. How do we help students anticipate what it means to be socialized to go into college. And what role does high school and teachers and administrators play in creating role modeling behaviors or model behaviors necessary to be successful in their transition? The transition to college, when we start thinking about when they get here, what academic support practice focused on transitions? There are a lot of institutions that have those first year extended orientations. Those extended orientations are a critical element in helping students navigate an institution like the size of Texas A&M. The fact is we have a 52,000 person campus. And you're a first generation student that's coming from the Valley that has a high school of about 1,000. When you come here, it's a daunting task. What role do we play in helping them navigate those treacherous waters? And of course, this notion of engagement. Earlier, Ashton said normative behaviors from this idea that how do we get students to be engaged with people who they consider important others, or the subjective norm. We need to create opportunities to enhance normative behaviors with students who can connect to the students who are coming in. What are the first generation students who are successful in their second year can reach to the first generation students coming in their first year? How do we start creating normative behaviors of what it means to be engaged on campus? How do we incorporate that into our discussion with what we call, and we'll talk about this in a minute, this notion of near-peer mentoring. Near-peer mentoring is some of the work that I'm going to be talking about in a minute. And then finally, we need to understand how students work, how they handle the work and school balance. We need to engage with these students, we need to educate these students, and we need to empower these students. It is imperative that these students recognize that their struggle of trying to balance work and going to college isn't a struggle that they have to do alone. We have to create better mechanisms in higher education to help students deal with that demand. A lot of these students can't rely on their parents, can't rely on their peers, and have nowhere to turn on how to determine strategies to help them navigate engagement. And so that kind of leads you to the work that I'm doing today. And so this past June, we started a 3-year research project called the Texas Education Consortium for Male Students of Color. The literature clearly shows that there's gender differences, and more importantly, the literature clearly shows that there are male first-generation issues. And so we decided to take a closer look at what's happening to Latino males and African-American males, but primarily Latino males, in the state of Texas. With the funding from TG Foundation, the Greater Texas Foundation, in partnership with our college, the team that I'm working with, and the University of Texas at Austin Division of Diversity and Community Engagement, we created a partnership between the 2 flagship institutions. And these 2 flagship institutions, which I'm told is something that is a critical dynamic there that we have challenges with. But we created this partnership. And when we go, I'm going to be going to El Paso later on this month. And El Paso Community College and El Paso ISD. We're going to be meeting with these folks in El Paso. And when we have faculty, 2 faculty members, go and present from the 2 flagship institutions to El Paso Community College and El Paso ISD about what can we do to partner with you to help identify best practices to help these young men succeed, that is a very powerful partnership. So I encourage you to think about how do we create collaborative research initiatives and look and reach across the aisle and work with these folks. You'll see here University of Texas, Texas State, University of North Texas, University of Texas San Antonio, all these different 2-year institutions, and we also have K-12. I make a point to not just talk about collaboration, I make a point to model collaboration. So the work that I do engages not only higher education researchers, but K-12 researchers and K-12 administrators to focus on this issue. We need to take our blinders off and come to the recognition that this issue is not a question about pointing fingers about who should be responsible for resolving these issues. The fact is, we're all responsible. And how do we partner with higher education researchers and K-12 researchers to address this issue that what I consider is an epidemic in Texas higher education. But the fact is, we need to turn awareness into action. We need to understand that there's a silent crisis in Latino students' educational achievement. When we take a closer look, the Texas Coordinating Board made it a mandate as an initiative for the state of Texas to have more Latino students go to college. It is a mandate. I'm not making this up. This is what the state education policy leaders are saying we have to do. The fact is, it's not on anyone's radar yet, or not enough. And when you take a closer look at gender differences, that's really not on the radar. We need to understand the issue. We need to become more involved and understand the nuances of these issues. But understanding is not enough. I really want to tell you that the work that I did comes from the heart. The fact is, we have to believe that we can improve their educational success. We have to have a desire to want to improve these outcomes. You have to believe it. But understanding and believe it really isn't enough. The fact of the matter is we need to act. We need to commit to helping our students, Latino students succeed. All of this rhetoric means nothing if it doesn't translate into action. We have to understand that the work that we do doesn't belong simply in academic journals. The work that we do for the graduate students, how many graduate students are in the room? For the graduate students that are in the room, you are the next generation of scholars that are going to move the needle on this issue. Where do you want to be in that conversation? How do you want to change the narrative in terms of the work that we do? The fact of the matter is, I will have failed if the only recognition I get is because I publish a lot. I'll be honest with you. I believe my calling is greater than just being a great scholar. My calling is to move communities, to change generations of students. Willem Tierney, the president of AERA, wrote in a journal article once, says there are generations of students who are born into poverty and die in poverty. And the educational institution in our society is the only ladder that increases the probability of success. So when we start thinking about acting differently with the work that we did, we have to create research, we have to create initiatives, we have to create programming, policies that move the needle. So I challenge you, as you move forward in your work that you do with the ERC, with the departments that you represent, I challenge you to think differently about the work that you're doing and about the impact you want to have. It's not enough to just be aware. We have to take awareness into action. Thank you very much. Questions?